Welcome back. So happy to have you here as we carry on with this exciting new book. Really hope you're enjoying it so far. I love the first book, and I'm so stoked so far with the second book. It's definitely holding up. So, I can't wait to get into the showdown between Herlock Sholmes, a beloved character that we are just now meeting, but also beloved because of his history with this podcast. We've done 6 Sherlock Holmes books, so if you need some more of this type of awesome mystery stuff in your life, go and check out the backlist. You can also go to anotherworldaudiobooks.com and you can request a free audiobook there as well and get all the Sherlock Holmes goodnesses in the Another World Audiobooks library, so be sure to check that out. I do have to split this one up. I'm so sorry. I hate having to split chapters in 2, and I decided that what I'm going to do, instead of just moping about it, is I'm going to do something. So right now, we've got 2 people on Patreon who are patrons of the podcast and donating a little bit to the podcast on a monthly basis, and if we can get that up to 12 patrons there on Patreon, I am going to make sure that we don't split up chapters anymore. So it doesn't matter the dollar amount, I just want to get up to at least 12 patrons. So if that could be you, go to anotherworldaudiobooks.com. You can click on support the podcast, and like I said, I want to keep bringing this to you, and there's a lot of work goes into these and a lot of time and effort and stuff. So if we can get up to 12 patrons, I will definitely not be splitting up episodes, splitting up chapters going forward. And if you can help us do that, I would really appreciate it. If not, no worries, guys. I'm going to still continue bringing you awesome content as often as I can and as long of episodes as I can. But just gotta do what I gotta do. So if you can help support the podcast in that way, I would really, really appreciate it. And I just, thank you guys for listening. I so appreciate it. But we're bringing you chapter 2, part 1 here today, and we'll bring you chapter 2, part 2 here next week. And let's see if we can get up to that up to 12 patrons, and then we'll kind of go from there. So thanks, guys, for listening. And without further ado, let's get into part 1 of chapter 2. Chapter 2: The Blue Diamond. On the evening of March 27th, at number 134 Avenue Henri Martin, in the house that he had inherited from his brother 6 months before, the old general, Baron d'Autrec, ambassador at Berlin under the Second Empire, was asleep in a comfortable armchair, while his secretary was reading to him, and the sister Auguste was warming his bed and preparing the night lamp. At 11 o'clock, the sister, who was obliged to return to the convent of her order at that hour, said to the secretary, "Mademoiselle Antoinette, my work is finished. I am going." "Very well, sister." "Do not forget that the cook is away, and that you are alone in the house with the servant." "Have no fear for the Baron. I sleep in the adjoining room, and always leave the door open." The sister left the house. A few moments later, Charles, the servant, came to receive his orders. The Baron was now awake, and spoke for himself.
"The usual orders, Charles. See that the electric bell rings in your room, and at the first alarm, run for the doctor. Now, Mademoiselle Antoinette, how far did we get in our reading?"
"Is Monsieur not going to bed now?"
No, I will go later. Besides, I don't need anyone."
20 minutes later, he was sleeping again, and Antoinette crept away on tiptoe. At that moment, Charles was closing the shutters on the lower floor. In the kitchen, he bolted the door leading to the garden, and in the vestibule, he not only locked the door, but hooked the chain as well. Then he ascended to his room on the 3rd floor, went to bed, and was soon asleep. Probably an hour had passed when he leaped from his bed in alarm. The bell was ringing. It rang for some time, 7 or 8 seconds perhaps, without intermission.
"Well?"
muttered Charles, recovering his wits.
"Another of the Baron's whims."
He dressed himself quickly, descended the stairs, stopped in front of the door, and rapped, according to his custom. He received no reply. He opened the door and entered.
No light,"
he murmured.
"What is that for?"
Then, in a low voice, he called,
"Mademoiselle."
No reply.
"Are you there, mademoiselle? What's the matter? Is Monsieur le Baron ill?"
No reply. Nothing but a profound silence that soon became depressing. He took 2 steps forward. His foot struck a chair, and having touched it, he noticed that it was overturned. Then, with his hand, he discovered other objects on the floor, a small table and a screen. Anxiously, he approached the wall, felt for the electric button, and turned on the light. In the center of the room, between the table and the dressing case, lay the body of his master, the Baron d'Autrec.
"What? It can't be possible,"
he stammered. He could not move. He stood there with bulging eyes, gazing stupidly at the terrible disorder, the overturned chairs, a large crystal candelabra shattered in 1,000 pieces, the clock lying on the marble hearthstone, all evidence of a fearful and desperate struggle. The handle of a stiletto glittered, not far from the corpse. The blade was stained with blood. A handkerchief, marked with red spots, was lying on the edge of the bed. Charles recoiled with horror. The body lying at his feet extended itself for a moment, then shrunk up again. 2 or 3 tremors, and that was the end. He stooped over the body. There was a clean-cut wound on the neck, from which the blood was flowing, and then congealing in a black pool on the carpet. The face retained an expression of extreme terror.
"Someone has killed him," he muttered. "Someone has killed him."
Then he shuddered at the thought that there might be another dreadful crime. Did not the Baron's secretary sleep in the adjoining room? Had not the assassin killed her also? He opened the door. The room was empty. He concluded that Antoinette had been abducted, or else she had gone away before the crime. He returned to the Baron's chamber. His glance falling on the secretary, he noticed that that article of furniture remained intact. Then he saw upon a table, beside a bunch of keys and a pocketbook that the Baron placed there every night, a handful of golden louis. Charles seized the pocketbook, opened it, and found some banknotes. He counted them. There were 13 notes of 100 francs each. Instinctively, mechanically, he put the banknotes in his pocket, rushed down the stairs, drew the bolt, unhooked the chain, closed the door behind him, and fled to the street. Charles was an honest man. He had scarcely left the gate when, cooled by the night air and the rain, he came to a sudden halt. Now he saw his action in its true light, and it filled him with horror. He hailed a passing cab and said to the driver,
"Go to the police office and bring the commissary. Hurry, there has been a murder in that house."
The cab driver whipped his horse. Charles wished to return to the house, but found the gate locked. He had closed it himself when he came out, and it could not be opened from the outside. On the other hand, it was useless to ring, as there was no one in the house. It was almost an hour before the arrival of the police. When they came, Charles told his story and handed the banknotes to the commissary. A locksmith was summoned, and after considerable difficulty, he succeeded in forcing open the garden gate and the vestibule door. The commissary of police entered the room first, but immediately turned to Charles and said, "You told me that the room was in the greatest disorder." Charles stood at the door, amazed, bewildered. All the furniture had been restored to its accustomed place. The small table was standing between the 2 windows, the chairs were upright, and the clock was on the center of the mantel. The debris of the candelabra had been removed.
"Where is Monsieur le Baron?"
stammered Charles.
"That's so,"
exclaimed the officer.
"Where is the victim?"
He approached the bed and drew aside a large sheet under which reposed the Baron d'Autrec, formerly French ambassador at Berlin. Over him lay his military coat, adorned with the Cross of Honor. His features were calm, his eyes were closed.
"Someone has been here,"
said Charles. "How did they get in?"
"I don't know, but someone has been here during my absence. There was a stiletto on the floor, there, and a handkerchief stained with blood on the bed. They are not here now. They have been carried away, and someone has put the room in order."
"Who would do that?"
"The assassin."
"But we found all the doors locked."
"He must have remained in the house."
"Then he must be here yet, as you were in front of the house all the time." Charles reflected a moment, then said slowly,
"Yes, of course. I didn't go away from the gate."
"Who was the last person you saw with the Baron?"
"Mademoiselle Antoinette, his secretary."
"What has become of her?"
"I don't know. Her bed wasn't occupied, so she must have gone out. I'm not surprised at that. She is young and pretty."
"But how could she leave the house?"
"By the door,"
said Charles.
But you had bolted and chained it.
Yes, she must have left before that.
And the crime was committed after her departure?
Of course,
said the servant. The house was searched from cellar to garret, but the assassin had fled. How and when? Was it he or an accomplice who had returned to the scene of the crime and removed everything that might furnish a clue to his identity? Such were the questions the police were called upon to solve. The coroner came at 7 o'clock, and at 8 o'clock Monsieur Dudouis, the head of the detective service, arrived on the scene. They were followed by the Procurer of the Republic and the investigating magistrate. In addition to these officials, the house was overrun with policemen, detectives, newspaper reporters, photographers, and relatives and acquaintances of the murdered man. A thorough search was made. They studied out the position of the corpse according to the information furnished by Charles. They questioned Sister Auguste when she arrived, but they discovered nothing new. Sister Auguste was astonished to learn of the disappearance of Antoinette Briard. She had engaged the young girl 12 days before on excellent recommendations, and refused to believe that she would neglect her duty by leaving the house during the night.
But you see, she hasn't returned yet, said the magistrate, and we are still confronted with the question, what has become of her?
I think she was abducted by the assassin,
said Charles. The theory was plausible, and was borne out by certain facts. Monsieur Dudouis agreed with it. He said,
Abducted? Ma foi, that is not improbable. Not only improbable, said a voice, but absolutely opposed to the facts. There is not a particle of evidence to support such a theory.
The voice was harsh, the accent sharp, and no one was surprised to learn that the speaker was Ganimard. In no one else would they tolerate such a domineering tone.
Ah, it is you, Ganimard, exclaimed Monsieur Dudouis. I had not seen you before. I have been here since 2 o'clock. So, you are interested in some things outside of lottery ticket number 514, the affair of the Rue Clapeyron, the blonde lady and Arsene Lupin?
Laughed the veteran detective.
I would not say that Lupin is a stranger to the present case, but let us forget the affair of the lottery ticket for a few moments and try to unravel this new mystery.
Ganimard is not one of those celebrated detectives whose methods will create a school, or whose name will be immortalized in the criminal annals of his country. He is devoid of those flashes of genius which characterize the work of Dupin, Lecoq, and Sherlock Holmes. Yet, it must be admitted, he possesses superior qualities of observation, sagacity, perseverance, and even intuition. His merit lies in his absolute independence. Nothing troubles or influences him, except perhaps a sort of fascination that Arsene Lupin holds over him. However that may be, there is no doubt that his position on that morning in the house of the late Baron d'Hautrec was one of undoubted superiority, and his collaboration in the case was appreciated and desired by the investigating magistrate.
In the first place,
said Ganimard,
I will ask Monsieur Charles to be very particular on one point. He says that, on the occasion of his first visit to the room, various articles of furniture were overturned and strewn about the place. Now, I ask him whether, on his second visit to the room, he found all of those articles restored to their accustomed places. I mean, of course, correctly placed.
Yes, all in their proper places,
replied Charles.
It is obvious, then, that the person who replaced them must have been familiar with the location of those articles.
The logic of this remark was apparent to his hearers. Ganimard continued.
One more question, Monsieur Charles. You were awakened by the ringing of your bell. Now who, do you think, rang it?
Monsieur le Baron, of course.
When could he ring it?
After the struggle? When he was dying?
Impossible, because you found him lying unconscious at a point more than 4 meters from the bell button.
Then he must have rung it during the struggle.
Impossible,
declared Ganimard,
since the ringing, as you have said, was continuous and uninterrupted and lasted 7 or 8 seconds. Do you think his antagonist would have permitted him to ring the bell in that leisurely manner?
Well, then, it was before the attack.
Also quite impossible, since you have told us that the lapse of time between the ringing of the bell and your entrance to the room was not more than 3 minutes. Therefore, if the bell rang before the attack, we are forced to the conclusion that the struggle, the murder, and the flight of the assassin all occurred within the short space of 3 minutes. I repeat, that is impossible.
And yet, said the magistrate, someone rang. If it were not the Baron, who was it?
The murderer?
For what purpose?
I do not know, but the fact that he did ring proves that he knew that the bell communicated with the servants' room. Now, who would know that except an inmate of the house?
Ganimard was drawing the meshes of his neck closer and tighter. In a few clear and logical sentences, he had unfolded and defined his theory of the crime, so that it seemed quite natural when the magistrate said, "As I understand it, Ganimard, you suspect the girl, Antoinette Briard."
I do not suspect her. I accuse her.
You accuse her of being an accomplice?
I accuse her of having killed Baron d'Hautrec.
Nonsense. What proof have you?
The handful of hair I found in the right hand of the victim.
He produced the hair. It was of a beautiful blonde color and glittered like threads of gold. Charles looked at it and said,
"That is Mademoiselle Antoinette's hair. There can be no doubt of it. And then there is another thing. I believe that the knife which I saw on my first visit to the room belonged to her. She used it to cut the leaves of books."
A long, dreadful silence followed, as if the crime had acquired an additional horror by reason of having been committed by a woman. At last, the magistrate said, "Let us assume, until we are better informed, that the Baron was killed by Antoinette Briard. We have yet to learn where she concealed herself after the crime, how she managed to return after Charles left the house, and how she made her escape after the arrival of the police. Have you formed any opinion on those points, Ganimard?"
None.
Well then, where do we stand? Ganimard was embarrassed. Finally, with a visible effort, he said,
All I can say is that I find in this case the same method of procedure as we found in the affair of the lottery ticket number 514. The same phenomena which might be termed the faculty of disappearing. Antoinette Briard has appeared and disappeared in this house as mysteriously as Arsene Lupin entered the house of Monsieur Detinan and escaped therefrom in the company of the blonde lady.
Does that signify anything?
It does to me. I can see a probable connection between those two strange incidents. Antoinette Briard was hired by Sister Auguste 12 days ago, that is to say, on the day after the blonde lady so cleverly slipped through my fingers. In the second place, the hair of the blonde lady was exactly the same brilliant golden hue as the hair found in this case.
So that, in your opinion, Antoinette Briard
is the blonde lady, precisely.
And that Lupin had a hand in both cases?
Yes, that is my opinion.
This statement was greeted with an outburst of laughter. It came from Monsieur Dudouis.
Lupin! Always Lupin! Lupin is into everything. Lupin is everywhere. Yes, Lupin is into everything of any consequence,
replied Ganimard, vexed at the ridicule of his superior.
Well, so far as I see, observed Monsieur Dudouis, you have not discovered any motive for this crime. The secretary was not broken into, nor the pocketbook carried away. Even a pile of gold was left upon the table. Yes, that is so, exclaimed Ganimard. But the famous diamond? What diamond? The blue diamond. The celebrated diamond which formed part of the royal crown of France, and which was given by the Duc d'Orléans to Leonard Lebrun, and at the death of Leonard Lebrun, was purchased by the Baron d'Hautrec as a souvenir of the charming comédienne that he had loved so well. That is one of those things that an old Parisian like I does not forget.
It is obvious that if the blue diamond is not found, the motive for the crime is disclosed, said the magistrate. But where should we search for it?
On the Baron's finger,
replied Charles.
He always wore the blue diamond on his left hand.
I saw that hand, and there was only a plain gold ring on it, said Ganimard as he approached the corpse.
Look in the palm of the hand,
replied the servant.
Ganimard opened the stiffened hand.
The bezel was turned inward, and in the center of that bezel, the blue diamond shone with all its glorious splendor.
The deuce,
muttered Ganimard, absolutely amazed.
I don't understand it. You will now apologize to Lupin for having suspected him, eh?
said Monsieur Dudouis, laughing. Ganimard paused for a moment's reflection, and then replied sententiously,
It is only when I do not understand things that I suspect Arsene Lupin.
Such were the facts established by the police on the day after the commission of that mysterious crime. Facts which were vague and incoherent in themselves, and which were not explained by any subsequent discoveries. The movements of Antoinette Bria remained as inexplicable as those of the blonde lady, and the police discovered no trace of that mysterious creature with the golden hair who had killed Baron d'Hautrec and had failed to take from his finger the famous diamond that had once shone in the royal crown of France. Alright, thanks for listening, guys. Appreciate it. And thank you for sharing the podcast. That is the best way for other people to find it and help us to grow. I love doing this. I love being able to narrate audiobooks. It's such a good creative outlet for me, and I'm just so glad. It just makes me so incredibly grateful and happy that there are people around the world. We've got, I think it's over 100 countries that have listened to this podcast. It's crazy. So thank you to every single one of our listeners around the world and all the supporters of the podcast as well. If you want to become a patron and help us not have to split up chapters like this anymore, just go to anotherworldaudiobooks.com. You can click on support the podcast, and that'll take you over to Patreon where you can support the podcast. Like I said, once we get to 12, I will not be breaking up chapters like this anymore, and I can't wait to get to that point so that I can just bring you the full chapter and all of its goodness. And who knows, if we get up, maybe we'll set another milestone after we hit 12, and we'll go to two chapters a week. That is definitely a possibility, and I want to get there, so I need your help. So head over to anotherworldaudiobooks.com, click on support the podcast, and I will see you here next week with part 2 of chapter 2. Thanks.